You know, it's one thing to talk about it, but again, when you can validate this kind of information with science, and that's what Dr. Alvin Berger has done, right? When it comes to oil, he's researched this.
He's spent his entire career researching oil, and he's going to teach us about an oil that I bet no one has ever heard of before.
Wow, take a look at this.
I am so excited that you're here today. Thank you so very much. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself and your name?
Yeah, my name is Alvin Berger. I've been in nutrition research for the last 30 years. Educationally, I have a bachelor's and then a master's in aquaculture and fish nutrition. I have a PhD in human nutrition, specializing in fat metabolism. And then I did a postdoctoral fellowship at Georgetown University in molecular cell signaling of lipids. Then I went on to work for a number of both large and small companies such as Nestle and Cargill over a long career. And I'm also an adjunct professor at 2 universities.
That's remarkable. So you became fascinated with fat and did all of this research. What was it that really led you into this particular area?
Well, the areas that I focus right now are on the ketogenic fats and also the unusual conifer type of fatty acids, the skiadonic acid.
Okay, so let me ask you 2 questions there.
Mm-hmm.
So you focus on the ketogenic fats. Why is that?
The ketogenic fats were of particular interest because I unfortunately have a child with type 1 diabetes, no family history, and he was being advised by the typical regulatory authorities like the American Diabetes Association and the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation to consume these high-carb diets. The idea is if you're already dealing with a disease, why stress yourself emotionally by having to limit your carbohydrate intake? So he was consuming these carbohydrate, very high carb diets, and then he was having these constant ups and downs with his blood sugar. So you take a high carb diet and you take insulin, but maybe you overshoot it. So then you're low, and then you eat carbs to try to bring it back. So you're doing this kind of yo-yo all day long, and that seemed crazy to me. So I got interested in the ketogenic fats originally to help my son, because those fats are converted to ketone bodies. We're talking about the chain length of C8 and C10 in particular here. So they get converted to ketone bodies. The ketone bodies get taken up by the tissues, muscles and brain, but it doesn't require insulin. So for a diabetic, it's usually important to have an energy source that doesn't require insulin.
So how old was he when you decided to take him out of the high carb diet and put him into a ketogenic?
So he was diagnosed at age 6, and he was on the high carb, SAD type of American diet for about 6 months. And that's when we said this just doesn't make any sense. So then he went on a ketogenic type of diet, and he had been getting insulin per the doctor's orders. And because he was now on a ketogenic diet, he needed less and less insulin. And then eventually he needed no insulin. But when we started this, the idea was not to take him off insulin. It was just to give him a healthier diet. But there was no point in giving him insulin anymore. It would only make his blood sugar low. So then for a full year, he was on a ketogenic diet with no insulin at all.
And when was that? At what age?
So this is around age 7.
Wow.
And then for another full year, he was on a low-carb diet. He started increasing his carbs, and he was taking just Lantus, which is the long-acting insulin, but not taking insulin with meals. Over the years, it's very challenging with children, as you know, to keep them on any kind of dietary regimen, and there's peer pressure to stay up with their friends who are having these high-carb diets, and so he's drifted back towards a higher carb diet. But we still have certain rules in our house. I mean, there's no Cokes, and I've run up against a brick wall trying to talk to the JDRF and the ADA about low-carb diets. And so I've learned to position it a little differently to families. I don't really talk about diabetes. I just talk about the fact that there's only 4% at best of children that meet the dietary guidelines that we set for them in terms of fruits and vegetables and healthy fats and so on and so on. So that's kind of my story. That's how I try to get kids to eat better.
So he was diagnosed at 6 years old. How old is he now?
Now he's 14.
That is remarkable. And he's probably at the stage where he's getting the most peer pressure, but I'm sure over time he will revert to fully what he benefited from early on.
Yeah, I mean, as parents, you can only hope that the educational efforts you've made at the younger age now, we hope that when he's, say, 18, 22, he'll start to realize it doesn't make sense, the eating these high-carb diets, and we hope that he'll revert and transform back to a low-carb diet. And ironically, during his period of learning to eat low-carb, the whole family around him has become low carb. So I eat a lot less carb than he does, as does my wife.
Do you do the ketogenic diet and your wife?
We do ketogenic diets, but we don't believe in extreme rigor when it comes to food. We're strong believers in the hedonistic value of food. And as someone like myself, coming out of competitive gymnastics background with 5 hours a day in a gym, I feel like I've had enough regimentation for several lifetimes. So I'm a big believer in trying to eat well, but then when I want to have that piece of chocolate or whatever the case is, glass of wine, that there's never any guilt about it. It has to feel, very pleasurable. In order to enjoy something, you can't be having guilt feelings.
I completely agree with that.
Yeah.
And do you find that most of the time you're burning fat for your fuel versus glucose?
I would say that
Yeah.
for sure, because the carbs that I do take are the low glycemic variety, so they're not really able to spare the fat oxidation. And because I'm on a high fat diet, I'm constantly burning fat. And I actually really respect the Eskimo kind of diets.
Yeah.
So I often joke to people I'm probably the closest thing you'll get to meeting an Eskimo. It's not really true because I don't have access to seal meat
Right.
and walrus meat and so on. But I do try hard, and I'm a believer in there's no limit on how much omega-3 you can take. They've tried to set limits, and they can't ever reach an endpoint because they can never find anything negative to show. So sardines in the morning is not uncommon, and again, sardines at lunch, and then salmon in the evening, and on top of that another 2 to 4 grams of fish oil is not uncommon for me.
So I was in Dutch Harbor in Alaska recently, and I was meeting with some of the Eskimos, the Inuits, the locals, and they were speaking exactly in the same way that you just were, getting the most fatty, blubberish food that they could, if it was from the seals, and then that would be what would give them their energy. So rather than having like a cup of coffee, they would literally be eating fatty, blubbery food, meats, in order to get their energy. With the sardines and the salmon and that whole mindset, it does make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I've even, as I've transformed in my personal life to eating more fat, I remember the days that when I would have, say, sardines, I would avoid the oil that was with the sardines. And now it's like, bring it on, olive oil with the fish oil, just fine.
So when you talk about those earlier days when you would avoid the fat and the research that you were doing, what helped you to transform that mindset, and what do you believe now that's different than what you were believing at that time?
Well, I came out of I'm classically trained through, academically, and there was always the teaching that, fat led to hardening of the arteries, was bad for your health. And although I was always passionate about the good aspects of fat, we were trained and we would teach others to limit the amount of fat. So the transformation has really been to eat, I call it high healthy fat diets. So it's not really telling people go out and eat whatever you want in terms of fats. It's just saying use some common sense. You don't have to worry about how much olive oil you have, fish oil, go at it. Things like the coconut, people I think overdo it. For me, a couple tablespoons is more than enough. So just, common sense. And like I said, I'm very interested in the hedonistic values of eating. So I would like that everyone can sit down and not, back like in the old days, counting, measuring, and just kind of enjoy the fats. They have nice taste. Add it plentifully to your salad.
When you say the hedonistic aspects of eating, can you elaborate and give us some more perspective on that?
I think for me, it's just pleasure in eating, because all those years as a gymnast where, I was watching every morsel that went into my body. So it's just kind of letting go a little bit and taking pleasure in your food. And because I'm a big believer that you can be very fit and youthful for your age without living these lifestyles that I see some people where they have to ask a million questions about everything that they put in their mouth. And so it's all this kind of moderation. Or when you hear people say, these generalized statements like meat is bad,
Right.
it's overly simplistic. I mean, it's all about the amounts and types. So you can enjoy that steak. Like, I'll give you another example. Like, I happen to like swordfish. It happens to have high mercury. So before my wife can remind me about the mercury, I often say I'm going to be getting my mercury tonight.
I really appreciate that point of view. So for you with coconut oil and MCT oil and your son with his type 1 diabetes, did you, when you first started to get him onto the ketogenic diet, I imagine you probably gave him quite a bit of MCT oil?
Yeah, MCT oils, more fish oils, efforts in whatever he would eat to pile it on, whether it was olive oil or canola oils. So if I was making my son pasta and it would be the low carb types, then we would always add extra oil. And then a lot of these oils you can fry with lower temperature, so you don't reach the point where they start to smoke, the smoke point. But, so I would always add extra. If he was having tofu, it would always be extra tablespoons of oil added.
And which kind of oils, like the MCT oils?
Well, we use MCT oils, olive oils, and high quality canola oils when they don't want that olive oil kind of taste.
Right. So if you take MCT oil and you look at coconut oil, can you describe the difference between the two?
I mean, the coconut oil is about 10 to 15% C8 and C10, whereas the products that we and others sell are 100% C8.
So an MCT oil is 100%?
I call them true MCTs.
Okay.
Because people confuse all these things. So the C12, the lauric, is where all the confusion happens, because that's the major component of coconut oil.
So the lauric acid
Is C12.
So is considered C12. And lauric acid, for a lot of people, monolauric acid, lauric acid, like I take monolauric acid as something to sort of protect my immune system at different times. But the lauric acid that's in the coconut oil is at what percentage in coconut oil?
Let me just step into the chemistry a little bit. So you have the free fatty acids, which is lauric acid. And then you have the monoglyceride form, the monolaurin. And then you have the triglyceride forms.
Okay.
And coconut oil is all going to be in triglyceride form. So it's going to have lauric acid. Remember, on that glycerol backbone, you have the 3 carbon positions.
Right.
So you're going to have the lauric in one of those positions matched up with other fatty acids, like palmitate, stearate, myristate, and so on. So part of the first source of confusion is when people talk about so-called antimicrobial properties of coconut oil.
Right.
That was work that was attributed to the monoglyceride form or the free forms, not the triglyceride form.
I see.
So when people start telling me about antimicrobial properties of coconut oil, it's not really the form in coconut oil that's antimicrobial. And the second challenge with the so-called antimicrobial, in today's era, we've moved to the point of understanding that microbes are good. So I would say, to challenge someone when they throw those kind of statements around, well, what microbes are you killing and where in the gut? And I've done that many a time and no one can answer it because, people just get accustomed to kind of throwing things around.
Yeah.
But if it's the free acid or the monoglyceride form, it has been shown in test tubes at least to have anti-Clostridia type properties, and that's good. And they're used as food preservatives as well.
And that's from the coconut oil. So
It's from breakdown. It's from chemically derived breakdown products from coconut oil.
Got it.
Not coconut oil in the intact form.
Okay.
And so when people talk about coconut oil being ketogenic, it's far less ketogenic than the true MCTs, C8 and C10.
Okay.
And within those, C8 being the most potent with respect to the raising of ketone bodies in the bloodstream.
So C8 and C10, can you talk about each of those so that we're real clear?
Yeah. So they're naturally present in breast milks, bovine milks, and particularly goat milks, the caprines. And that's where they get the name, like caprylic, caproic, capric, C8, C10, C12, C6, C8, C10 rather. And but they're naturally present in relatively small amounts. So to get a more ketogenic product, those fatty acids get enriched. So they're sourced from coconut oil and palm kernel oil. And then through a series of distillation steps, not involving solvents, you end up with the C8 fatty acid. It gets combined with heat and pressure to form the triglyceride molecule, which in the case of C8 would be just C8. And then you can have the C8 and C10 varieties of MCT oils. And those come in typically 60-40 or 70-30 ratios,
C8 to C10.
C8 to C10.
Okay. And what are the best ratios?
Well, the pure C8 is the one that we sell, and also the one that's being developed as a drug in the Axona Xera product for Alzheimer, and that's the most potent. That's the one that gives the largest increase in ketone bodies in the bloodstream. It's also amongst the C8, C10, and C12, the fatty acid that does not get into adipose tissue at all.
So the C8 is what we really want to be ingesting.
That's it. There's nothing wrong with the C8, C10, but since, from a price point of view, it's not that much more, people like me would just as soon get the pure C8 form.
Right, right. So through all the research that you've done for your entire career, you see that the C8 in the pure form makes sense, and that's a form of MCT oil that you take regularly, I'm sure.
I do take it.
Yeah.
And unlike others, I don't add it to like coffee and things like that, which is very trendy these days, because I find it's much more digestible in a solid form with solid foods.
So what do you mean?
So for me, it would mean adding it to like on a sauce, for example, with your quinoa as an example, or I personally have like a yogurt slurry every morning, where I take like a goat yogurt,
Yum.
and then I take the MCT oil, and then this one's a little gross, but I add fish oil right to that, mix it up, and
Yeah.
that's kind of my breakfast.
So that MCT oil, that C8,
That's the C8.
that is the pure distilled form of it,
Correct.
without any solvents or anything like
That's
that,
correct.
right? So how
Yes.
is it actually processed?
Well, basically, these are typically coming from countries where coconuts or palm kernel oil are grown, Malaysia, Philippines. And then in these large factories, they use techniques, distillation, to get the free fatty acids.
Right.
And then they have the C8, and they call them buckets sometimes. So you have the C8 bucket and the C10 bucket. And then you have glycerin or glycerol, they're the same. And that's where under heat and pressure, either in the US or in other countries, they're re-esterified. It's sort of analogous, like in the fish oil space, when you hear people talk about RTGs, re-esterified triglyceride. It's the same technology. You're putting two
Interesting.
things back together.
So why do you think that most of the MCT oils are combinations of C8 and C10 or C12 versus just this pure C8?
It's more expensive to have the pure C8 form is one reason.
Yeah.
And the C8 is a relatively new form. The MCTs this goes back to the 20s really, but they had some popularity in the 60s.
The C8s?
For digestive health. The MCTs, the
MCTs,
810s.
yes.
And then in the 80s, it was a big thing among bodybuilders, and that was an 810 variety. And so the C8 is a more recent incarnation of this, maybe like 2010 kind of period. So it's much more recent, but more ketogenic. I also like the fact that it's being developed as a drug, because I don't have the finances to do my own clinical work. So I can kind of tag along with what I see
Right.
other companies doing clinically. And then since I know I'm essentially selling the same thing,
Right.
I can kind of use that information.
So it's being developed as a drug for what?
Alzheimer's. And also mild cognitive impairment. What happens is as we age, there's an inability to take up glucose. This is sometimes termed type 3 diabetes.
Right.
And so we age, and this is in normal aging. So there's a challenge to take up the glucose, and the brain is essentially being starved of energy. So in Alzheimer's, at least some types of Alzheimer's, and in mild cognitive impairment, they can show if they give those folks C8, C10 MCTs, or C8 MCT, a big improvement in learning, paragraph recall, something we've done when we were at some point in our life, where you read something and then you're asked to, spell out the meaning of that paragraph. And I like those kind of endpoints because it's something people can relate to. But what's most striking to me is a more recent study was done with men in Japan, but they were cognitively normal, so they had no impairment.
Right.
They gave them MCT oils. It was an 810 MCT oil in that case. And they gave them a battery of cognitive tests, and they showed improvement. When I saw that study, I was just about flipping out, because then I was saying, this stuff should be in every nursing home.
Right.
We should all just start taking this stuff. It doesn't harm anything. It just gives us energy, possible cognitive benefits. And what I experience in my personal life is, I call it like the super multitasking mode. So when I take either MCTs or exogenous ketone bodies, and I go down into my office, and I work with 2 different computers, each with 2 screens, like a little madman kind of running between these computers. So I feel, particularly for someone my age, to still feel that level of sharpness and that ability to multitask effectively, that I derive those benefits from these ketogenic fats.
It's remarkable, and it's really interesting to hear about the C8 and like you said, the research that's going on right now. When do you think this drug will come out into the marketplace? Do you have a sense?
I don't actually know.
Yeah.
They tried to develop it as a clinical food, and then they got into some problems with regulatory, and then it's become a drug. So I'm not actually sure of that. But that was acquired by Nestle, so it'll be a Nestle.
And you worked for Nestle for many years in Switzerland.
In Switzerland.
Very close to where I was born.
That's right. I worked at Vacher Les Blancs, which is the research center.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
So when you think about the European diet versus the American diet, and one observation that I had growing up in Europe was just a love for cheese, high fats, taking the cream off the milk. I was born in Switzerland. I thought this is what a little kid thinks, but I thought I was born out of one of the holes in Swiss cheese. I ate so much Swiss cheese all the time and just never was ever told to hold back. And I didn't know what non-fat and low-fat was.
That's right.
Until I came to this country. And the other big sort of shock when you come to this country from a European country is, especially in the 80s and 90s, you look and you see just the disparity in weight. And more than 60% of this country is either overweight or obese. For you, as someone who did so much research here in this country and then lived in Europe and did that work, what is your perspective on the low-fat, no-fat, that whole world?
Well, I think we could all agree that the low-fat is a failed experiment in the U.S. I mean, what did it really lead to? It led to more obesity, more diabetes, more insulin resistance, more metabolic syndrome. It's hard to find anything really positive to say about the low-fat craze, because what did it really accomplish is people ate less fat, they started eating more high carbs, the foods and everything had more sugar, since they no longer had the filler fats to get flavor. More insulin was needed. People weren't exercising anymore, and then their bodies just make the fat anyway. That's what happens, right? Excess sugar goes to acetate, lipogenesis, you make fat. You make saturated fats, and then it gets stored in adipose. So it was really a failed experiment. But to your point about Europe, like you asked me before about hedonistic, having spent over 7 years there, people eat well, but I see people laughing when they're eating and relaxing. I don't see all this counting of things with the same rigor, and they're healthier and they exercise. And as a person with a company, and I get asked a lot, it's trendy right now to talk about what is the millimolar level of ketone bodies in your bloodstream. I know the answers to those kind of questions, but I don't want people really thinking in that way and carrying around strips and things, because I think you can be healthy without trying to measure everything like that.
Yeah, it is definitely part of the mindset here, just being able to have access to all of the different apps and, like you said, the strips and testing. And at the end of the day, once you start to really embrace what works best for your own health, you feel it, right?
Yeah.
Like you've got your 2 sets of computer screens and you love that, and you know that you're cognitively able to focus on maybe a lot more than you would have been able to if you weren't eating your sardines.
Yeah. And like you brought up cheese, like I also love cheese, but we're all individuals, and I can tell you, I come from a family with elevated cholesterol. Eat cheese, my cholesterol's too high. Take it away, my cholesterol's low.
Right.
So but I'm not going to generalize and tell other people how they should limit their cheese. I can speak for myself. I've done that self-experiment many a time, so I have to limit that.
It's very fascinating to learn about the MCT oils in these different ways. Tell me more about some of the lipids that you've researched and worked on.
Well, I've had the privilege, working for companies like Nestle and Cargill to, unlike most lipid people who are specialized, to understand the gamut of fats, from lards to coconuts to olive oils and so on. So I have a pretty wide breadth of oils relative to other people who are lipid specialists. But the conifer oils are of particular a passion to mine, and that led to the creation of the company Skiodonics Incorporated. And so if you start looking at, before we had, let's call it modern medicine, cultures around the world, American Indians, traditional cultures, all the African cultures, South American, they all consumed a lot of these conifer seeds. These are your junipers, your pines, your ginkgos, and hundreds of others. And before the advent of modern cosmetics, what were they doing? They were smearing salves of these kind of conifer seeds onto their skin.
Right.
So that's how I got interested in all this.
So you were learning about these seeds that would be smeared onto their skin. I know I work with an indigenous group off the coast of Panama, and there are certain seeds that they smear onto their skin. They've
Right.
smeared onto my skin before that
Right.
act as sunscreens.
Right, yeah.
And is that sort of what these conifer seeds were used for?
No, not necessarily. It was mostly anti-inflammatory properties.
Oh.
So the conifer seeds, when I started looking through traditional Chinese medicine books, and I'd look up ginkgo and a whole slew of other seeds, they always talked about these potent anti-inflammatory properties. And so we started, as part of my PhD work, looking at the molecular structure of the fatty acids, and they were missing one double bond. So in 20 carbons, the double bonds from the carboxyl end are 5, 11, 14. Whereas in a normal fatty acid, it goes in groups of 3, like 5, 8, 11, 14.
So what was significant about that missing
So
piece?
without that missing double bond, you're not able to form prostaglandins, leukotrienes, and the other eicosanoids. So it's really a quite interesting story. Before I ever did a single study, just by looking at the structure, I already knew that this would and should have potent anti-inflammatory properties.
So these seeds that indigenous people were using and putting them on their own skin, they were benefiting from the anti-inflammatory properties of these seeds.
Correct, as well as oral.
Oh, okay. So eating them,
Yes.
like the juniper berries, is that
Correct.
what you were saying?
Juniper and other very exotic ones, many without common names or just have names in the native languages.
Right. So it's eating different berries or seeds. Are they
Yes.
berries as well, or just
Berries and seeds.
right?
Yeah. And so I got interested in this, and then so that was part of my PhD work at UC Davis. So we completed now about 25 studies in various models: arthritis, organ transplant, lupus, and so on.
And were the studies done taken or were I mean, I don't know if they were animal or
yeah,
human
these
studies.
were all rodent studies.
Okay. So it was oral consumption or
They were all
Okay.
oral. But at one point, when I worked for Nestle, in collaboration with Galderma and L'Oreal, we started looking at mouse models for the skin,
Right.
something called the erythema model. You essentially make an irritation on the mouse, and it gets a bump, more or less. And then you apply the oil topically, and we could take down the inflammation.
wow.
So we had that as data, and we started this company, Skiodonics Incorporated, to commercialize these oils. I had 20 years of know-how on the sourcing. So we spent another 2 years to figure out more on the sourcing, to find something that would be commercially feasible. Knowing that if we didn't have the sourcing figured out, when we spoke to other companies, it would always just be this kind of
course.
theoretical topic.
Right.
And they would say, come back when you've got the sourcing figured out.
And that can happen so much in the scientific community, right? Like you spend
Exactly.
20 years doing research, and then much of these incredible technologies never see the light of day.
Too expensive, or
Yes.
some remote mountain in
That's
the
right.
Himalayas. You know, so we have that, you know, fairly well sorted out. And I started to, we wanted to sell this as an oral supplement, but it did not have the GRAS, generally regarded as safe status.
Right.
And that was a potential bottleneck because companies and investors want you to, you know, rock
Absolutely.
and roll now, not hear
Yeah.
about a story that may emerge in 2 years. So because we had that earlier mouse data I mentioned on the skin, we started applying it to friends and colleagues and other professionals with psoriasis, eczema, wounds, and so on. And we started finding rather striking findings. And it started with a gentleman in Denmark. This is before we had any other data. He had a condition where he had these deep cuts between his fingers that would not heal. Interdigital fissures, they call it. And so he applied the oil, and they healed overnight.
Overnight.
So then I got this excited call in the morning saying, what's going on here? The cuts healed. So that was the first indication I knew that this was going to be very bioactive as a topical. So then we've gone on and given it to people with psoriasis, eczema, people that had problems with redness, wrinkling, and we keep seeing these striking benefits that happen rapidly, typically within one usage or 2 usages.
So why do we not know about this? Like, why is it's not in our diet? Where do we get the skiadonic acid?
Yeah, it's a good question. A lot of the way I like to think of it is we've kicked a lot of foods out of the food supply. So if you take conifers, this was consumed habitually in many cultures. In fact, it still is in Africa, in the Middle East, and so on and so on. But in the U.S., we've just stopped eating that way. And it used to be part of the food chain because we used to eat a lot of small mammals. So we used
like
to
what
eat,
kind of small mammals?
well, like squirrels.
What?
Yeah, all kind of little animals. That was part of the hunter and gatherer diet.
Right.
So the squirrels ate the seeds, and then we ate the squirrel.
Right.
Or the deers were eating the junipers, and then we ate the deer, the venison. But now that everything is done in cultured manners without free range to eat these berries, you're not seeing the accumulation.
Absolutely. So it's something that was in our diets, no longer exists in our diets, and yet it has this incredible anti-inflammatory benefit.
All of us make small amounts of it and get small amounts in the diet. About 0.1 to 0.2% is what we all have in our bloodstream. But these products that we produce have 20% skiadonic, so
Wow.
much more concentrated.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
And so 20 years of research and then several years of supply chain work. I mean, I know from the work that I've done over my entire career, you have to know where things come from in order to make sure that they're going to work in your own body. It's like you can do all the research, and if they're not sourced correctly, then so much can occur that you really don't want to have occur as,
Right.
Side effects of whatever is in the soil or
Right.
whatever it may be. So
Right.
that's really interesting.
So we highly purify these oils.
Right.
You'll hear people talk about, particularly lay people, how the oil should be crudely pressed and all these
Right.
things, and I get it.
Sure.
But when you're starting a company, if we do just simple cold pressing without refined bleaching and deodorizing, which removes everything
Right.
but the pure triglycerides that we care about, that could lead to problems that we don't need. So I'd rather start with this highly purified approach, and then over time, we could gradually pose questions like, what if we didn't do that level of processing?
Right, sure. So for you and for your son and for your wife, do you see the skiadonic acid as something that you will ingest for the rest of your life? How are you looking at it? Not just as a topical, I imagine.
Yeah, I would love to, that my whole family and friends
Yeah.
who are calling me constantly now that want to take it orally, that will be in the near future. But even in my family, just to finish on the topical, like my daughter has this eczematic skin, And I put it on her. There's a picture in the slide deck, showing how this big red rash was taken down in a single usage. And the other thing on my son is the diabetics. Most of them these days have these insulin pumps
Right.
and continuous glucose monitors, but they inevitably don't stay on. It's an adhesive. So then you apply these very strong adhesives, like a spray or a wipe, and it's on there real solid, which is what you want. But then the skin gets irritated.
Yeah.
So I've started using it on my son as a means to take care of that inflammation from the adhesive injury.
Is it in skincare products today?
No.
No.
We'll be launching a brand called Skia Essentials in a few weeks, and that'll be the start. And then thereafter, you'll see it probably branded and with other names
Yeah.
and so on by other companies.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about what some of our prehistoric dinosaurs were eating.
Well, it turns out if you look at the evolution of seeds, the so-called modern seeds are called angiosperms.
Okay.
The more primitive ones are called gymnosperms or conifers. And the ones people routinely know are your junipers and your pines and so on. But what really is fascinating to me, just as a scientist, is the dinosaurs, which existed 70 to say 200 million years ago, did not have these angiosperms. So they were consuming these conifer seeds. And then from the fossil record, you can see that the types of conifers they were consuming had high amounts of skiadonic acid. So how do you understand how much they were eating? It's kind of interesting there too. The closest living animal to a dinosaur to model how much they eat is an elephant. Just a large animal, and you start looking at the the intake of an elephant, and you can model it back to a dinosaur. Really
It's
interesting.
remarkable.
Yeah.
It's really, really interesting, and that you would do that kind of research, with your PhD. It's exciting for us to learn about this from you. It's really exciting. Where do you see the lipid research going over the next 5, 10 years?
Well, I think one of the trends you're going to see, the ketogenic fat movement, which was kind of a niche movement in the 80s, is now full string. And you see more and more companies are going to be launching lines, and I think to stand this apart from a company perspective, more and more innovative products,
Right.
different types of MCTs. The exogenous ketone bodies are hot right now, and it's not going to go away because it's one of the few nutrients that there's a real benefit. Most nutrients, people take it and you can tell them all about how great something is, but they don't feel it. But the advantage to these kind of products is when you take it, you feel it.
Right.
You get this energy buzz,
Sure.
but it's not a caffeine buzz. It's just energy going to your neurons.
So you're going to see that expanding and growing.
I think that's going to continue. It's just like if you look at fish oil, it started as kind of a small select number of people took it, die-hard nutrition people, fattists and so on, but now it's absolutely mainstream. So
excellent.
what happens in nutrition is eventually people don't really understand why something is good. They just know it's good. So ask someone why EPA and DHA are good. They probably can't give you a really solid answer, but it's good. So as we go on, people will start saying, oh, MCTs, those are good. I need those.
Right. And then starting to learn about which MCTs, right?
Yeah.
I wonder how many people really have heard about the different types of MCTs. It's probably very, very,
A very small
small.
subset, yeah.
Yeah. So I want to thank you so much for leading, being a leader in this area of lipid research. And while it started with your son and the need to really help your child with type 1 diabetes, you are able to help millions and millions of us through your research, through your focus. And I can't thank you enough for that.
And it's my pleasure. And it's rewarding for me to, finally realize my dream with MCTs and also skiadonic, and having, being able to have a business, but also realizing that I'm helping people and having people phoning me. And it's just very important to me.
See, again, I'm so fascinated by our experts because skiadonic acid? What? This is something I should know about.
You're right. I couldn't believe when I first learned about it how incredibly powerful it is for improving our health.